Glory Cloud Podcast, Episode 82. Well, stay tuned for a special interview this week. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Glory Cloud Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cahy, and our co-host, Todd Bordeaux, isn't able to join us today, so I'm flying solo. Before I introduce our guest, I'll just run through our regular housekeeping. Please do visit our show notes page over at meredithkline.com/podcast. There you can find all of the resources that we mention in the course of the episode. And if you have not yet rated us on iTunes, if you could give us a 5-star rating, that helps other people find us who are looking for good theological content in their podcasts. Also, another thing that you can do that is completely free and painless to support us is to subscribe to the podcast. And if you have a podcast app on your smartphone, you can do it there. Otherwise, we do have a subscribe link on the show notes page that will help you find other ways to do that on a computer or other device. And we ask that you continue to pray for Lee and Misty. They really need our prayers, and we want to support them as they work on their marriage. Finally, if you have the means to support us and you'd like to help us cover the monthly cost of hosting the audio files for this podcast, you can find a donate button over at meredithkline.com/podcast on the right-hand side of the page, and any amount helps. We very much appreciate all of our donors. Well, we are joined this week by a special guest, Pastor Gregory Reynolds. He is pastor emeritus at Amoskeag Presbyterian Church in Manchester, New Hampshire. He earned his Master of Divinity from Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, and he earned his Doctor of Ministry from Westminster Seminary in California. He has been ordained in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church since 1980, and he is the author of the book we're going to talk about today, The Word is Worth 1,000 Pictures, Preaching in the Electronic Age. Pastor Reynolds, welcome to the Glory Cloud Podcast.
Well, thank you, Chris. It's great to be on.
So tell us, what was your motivation? Why did you write The Word is Worth 1,000 Pictures?
Yes, that was, it turned into be a little different than I had expected. But when I began the doctoral program out at Westminster and Escondido, we had a month of matriculation. We had to take different courses. We had to come up with our thesis. I was wanting to not do something in historical theology, since I'd spent several decades actually, and then in the ministry for a decade, studying the Puritans and Reformed theology and the Magisterial Reformation. And so I felt that my countercultural thinking had been properly divested. So I realized I needed to go back to try to understand now the modern world in which we live with its electronic communications. And I wanted to encourage preachers, I guess including myself, that the live pastoral preaching is not an inferior means of communication. And I think whether it's said overtly or simply is exemplified in many evangelical churches, if you don't have the screen on the wall above the preacher, there's probably you're just an old fogey. And I didn't like that. I was, of course, not an old fogey at that point in life. And I realized that my colleagues needed that encouragement to see that the most effective way of ministering the word is live pastoral preaching, when the pastor knows the people to whom he is preaching and has a vital contact with them, and that his presence in the worship space is a very important and powerful means that God uses.
Okay, so you're writing primarily to pastors then?
Yes.
Okay. Now, you've divided the book up into 4 parts, and I'll just run through them quickly for our listeners. Part 1 is tools of engagement, the apologetic approach. Part 2 is tools of history, the history of communication study. Part 3 is tools of assessment, Christian media ecology. And part 4 is tools of communication and ecology of preaching. Given your emphasis on the term ecology from media ecology, it seems like Marshall McLuhan and Neil Postman have been very influential on your thinking.
Oh, yes, indeed. It was during the matriculating month there in Escondido that I had the privilege of having Joel Niederhood teach a course on preaching and how, particularly he focused on television, but I think he was looking at generally how the electronic environment affects the task of preaching. And when he taught that course, of course, we had to read a bunch of things. It was a 1-week intensive course, and the first thing I read was Postman's "Amusing Ourselves to Death," public discourse in the age of show business. That was in the middle of the 80s that was written, before really everyone was on the internet and that kind of thing. But very insightful. McLuhan had encouraged him because they knew one another quite well and worked with one another. But he encouraged him to put what he knew about media ecology into an institutional environment. So McLuhan himself was not an organizer of institutions, and so at NYU, Postman was able to start a doctoral program, which I believe continues to this day. So Amusing Ourselves to Death was eye-opening to me, and I was able, as soon as I got back to New York, where my ministry was in New Rochelle, I asked Postman if he would do an interview, and he was happy to do it. He said, most of the people interested in my book are evangelicals, and he got a big kick out of that, and I don't think fully understood why. But his chapter called Shuffle Off to Bethlehem, which is particularly on religious television, is really still today. It's very insightful and very helpful in terms of media ecology. And so that name, now, of course, there's a Media Ecology Association, which I've been a member of for a number of years. I think my dues have lapsed at this point, but it was a very useful connection back then. I even got to know and was saddened to hear recently that Eric McLuhan, Marshall's son, he died, I think, a month or two months ago, suddenly while he was on a speaking engagement. And he was very kind to communicate with me during that time and really expand my understanding of his father's teaching and his father's philosophy. So media ecology then was kind of loosely used back in the old days until the association was started, and then it became a real label for a school of thinking, which is largely based on McLuhan and Postman.
Wow. Yeah, Neil Postman's book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, really is a phenomenal work. Mike Horton required us to read that in, I believe it, I can't remember what course it was, but I'd actually read it before then, and I encourage all of our listeners to get that book and read it if you haven't. Even though he was focusing on television, what he says about electronic technology even applies to computers and smartphones and everything that we use. And I was going to ask you if you actually had the opportunity to interact with him, and it sounds like you did. Did you meet him in person, or was it just...
Yes, I went to NYU. He invited me to come into his office or offices. He had quite a crew of people doing research and work for him. And I spent 2 hours with him. So he was very generous with his time. And it was a great interview. I'm not an expert interviewer, so as I look back on it, there's some things that I would definitely improve. But he just gave a wealth of information. I think one of the things that was so impressive about the book is that it really supports the idea of the importance of personal presence in ministry, and anything that distances us from that personal presence has some liabilities. Now, right now, we're doing something where we're not even seeing each other's faces, and that's okay because this is it's a word-oriented medium, and radio is very different than television in that way. It tends to support substance and argument rather than image, and television, of course, distracts us with image, although there certainly have been some substantive programs on, such as Firing Line and things like that, but that's not the genius of television. So his focus on personal presence, of course, really helped me to develop the idea that there's nothing replaces live pastoral preaching. Along with this, I also became very interested, having read his book, in the nature of modern technology and the environment that it has created and the ways that it has changed our culture and its social institutions, as well as its ecclesiastical institutions. And so that then ended up making the first 8 chapters, really, I'm dealing with, it's all preparatory to the last 2 chapters, which, of course, deal directly with ministry of the word.
Excellent. So clearly, Neil Postman and his mentor, Marshall McLuhan, have been influences on your thinking. But you were also a student of Meredith Kline's, right?
Yes.
Okay. So now,
I wanted to say one more thing about Marshall McLuhan before we move on to my beloved professor, and that is that his McLuhan, unlike Postman, is a difficult writer to understand. And so it takes a lot of work. I thought back when I was in the counterculture in the 60s that I understood McLuhan. We even thought he was kind of one of us because of his crazy hairdo and the things he was saying about media. And the book that he came out, which was kind of a cult classic among let's say thinking counterculture types, The Medium is the Massage. And he did that with Quentin Fiore. And it's very visually oriented, and I didn't understand him at all when I was in the counterculture, and it took quite a while to really dig into his work. Understanding Media, the Extensions of Man, is the one that I recommend, because if you don't understand some fundamental things about his approach, then The Medium is the Massage will probably go over your head. But that's just a little bit of a warning, but I owe a tremendous debt to both him and his son Eric for the work that they've done in this field, which is foundational.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that word of caution. So as a student of Meredith Kline's, how did his theology influence your thinking as you wrote this book?
You know, it's interesting that I think that the way he taught, the way he exegetically unfolded the richness of the Old Testament, and the way that he built our confidence in the infallibility and the reliability of the Old Testament was an assumption of mine when I wrote the book. And I was just looking, I had forgotten, because of course, as you say, he never really wrote very much about preaching per se. So he didn't have articles on homiletics as far as I'm aware. And he didn't incorporate much of that into his writing. But I think for preachers, just developing that love of understanding the Christocentric nature and the richness of the Old Testament text, bringing that into preaching, it's a bedrock appreciation that underlies the book. Now, I did notice, however, that along those lines, I quoted him several times in the process of the book. One had to do with idolatry. And then also the other reference had to do with his work on the canon, and of course they're building our confidence in nature of God's word as being entirely reliable.
Okay. Yeah. I completely agree that it's almost impossible to find practical theological references in what he's written. And I can recall trying to have conversations with him in person about preaching or other practical theological matters, and he just wanted to change the subject. It wasn't something he was comfortable talking about. But he did have a profound place for preaching in his thinking, because he saw God speaking creation into existence in Genesis 1, and then he sees God speaking the new creation into existence in places like Romans 10:17. So does that relate at all to your part 4 in terms of tools of communication and ecology of preaching?
Well, yes. In fact, that's where I, of course, quote him on the reliability of the Old Testament canon. And it's certainly the idea that God spoke and everything came into existence with a series of his commands out of nothing is powerful, and it's a powerful place where we really begin in thinking about the nature of homiletics, because Paul in 2 Corinthians, actually, I believe it's chapter 4, relates the power, the life-changing power of the preaching of the gospel to the world-creating power of God's word back there in Genesis 1. And so certainly, again, that confidence and the rich sense of God's presence through the Old Testament text has been a great help to me, and that all came through Meredith's teaching as a professor back. And interestingly, while you had him in Escondido, because Escondido didn't exist until the year after I was graduated from Westminster in Philadelphia. And so that's where I had him, and he would in turn be traveling down from Gordon Conwell to come to teach prophets. And I also took Daniel during a winter course, and there was one other course, and I'm not remembering what it was. I think it was Zechariah. And so he had a profound influence on me. Interestingly, back in those days, it was his exegetical richness and not his covenant theology that impressed me. I really don't think I understood covenant theology in the way that I've come to, and with his tremendous help in clarifying with tremendous clarity the distinction between especially the covenant of works and the covenant of grace. Mm.
So I'm curious, what about his exegetical richness? Can you give some examples of that?
Well, one that I'm constantly coming across, and I always wondered why in Genesis 3, that no translation, including the ESV, gets it right according to his exegesis, and I think his exegesis makes much more sense in the context. But when it says that they walked with God in the cool of the day, and this is actually in the spirit of the day, and it's judgment day for them, because this was after the eating of the forbidden fruit. And so I've always been wondered. I mean, they heard, it's verse 8 of chapter 3, and they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and they fled. And so this is telling you that there's something, it's not this cool romantic scene of communion with God, it's judgment day. And it's the ruach of the day, the spirit of the day with a capital S. God is confronting them with their sin. So that would be just one example of where he brought out the richness of the text. And then his commentary on Zechariah is profound in terms of just unpacking the richness of the apocalyptic language in Zechariah, and placing it all in the context of the covenants. That's what he was also brilliant at doing. And I only really came to understand that in its fullness when we moved back here in the 90s. And when he taught in our church for 4 semesters, 4 falls, he taught 10 times. So I got to actually meet with him almost 40 times and discuss various topics. And I think we actually did talk about preaching as well. But you're right, that was not a topic that he majored in. But that was a rich time for me because I really got the covenants sorted out. I got all of that rich background and assumptions, really, of post-Reformation theology that he helped me to really see all of that, although he's not a post-Ref scholar. But he definitely, I believe, was able to articulate the covenant theology of our confession.
I'm glad you mentioned the time that he spent teaching at Amoskeag Presbyterian Church. I've stumbled onto the recordings that you have online at the church's website, so I'll link to those in our show notes page so that our listeners can make use of those as well. I think that Andrew Moody, who runs MeredithKline.com, has linked to many of those as well, but I appreciate you making those available.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, it's kind of humorous because when you're in your late 70s, you get set in your ways. In fact, a lot of us get kind of set in our ways earlier than that. But he did not like to be recorded and would never let anyone record him. And I had this wonderful little tape recorder. Of course, the quality of it isn't great, but it was probably the only way that I could have arranged this. And I begged him to let me do it. I said, it's probably the last time you're going to be teaching through all of the 4 courses that you've taught throughout your career. And he graciously let me do it. And then he, of course, because it stuck in his pocket, the little recorder, and then I clipped it to his shirt, the microphone, he totally forgot that he was being recorded. So that was a great blessing in God's providence.
Excellent. Thank you for doing that. So you spend some time in The Word is Worth 1,000 Pictures on postmodernism, and I wondered if you would maybe define postmodernism for our listeners and talk about whether you see any redeeming value in it.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's also somewhat controversial. I mean, the literature on the nature of postmodernism, or POMO, is definitely vast, and I give it a shot in the beginning, especially when I'm looking at the Apologetics of Fire, the 2nd chapter, and what I realized, because in some ways my early life, especially in the counterculture, is postmodern. And it was interesting that Francis Schaeffer was always talking about relativism being a huge problem in modernity. And, of course, what POMO has done is it represents a healthy challenge to the assumptions of modernism and its sort of monolithic rationality, or rationalism, I should say, not rationality. And the problem is that both POMO and modernism, one hyper-rationalistic and the other really irrational, are both functioning as would-be autonomous thinkers. And I think that's the problem for both of them, and that's how I analyze it in that chapter. And then I refer to that later on. Now, in architecture, which was my first profession, actually, and was my early training before I became a Christian. And then I did a lot of work in architecture after that to sort of pay the bills for school. I noticed with delight that what postmodernism did at its best was to get us to refer back to history. The international style of architecture, of course, had believed as a principle that you should put history away from you, that this was something brand new that we were doing in architecture. And of course, you see that in a lot of the mid 20th century architecture. And so what you see with postmodernism coming in, then architects began to look back at the styles and the philosophy of architecture in the past and bring it into their architecture. And so I appreciated this. Some of it, of course, is cynical. So there's a cynical look at the past. And I don't, off the top of my head, have examples, but there are plenty of them out there. So again, it has its good side, it has its bad side. And I'm happy for the fact that I've helped us to look at the meta-narratives. And also, I think it was humbling for modernism, because modernism takes the approach that we can solve all problems through the work of science and mathematics, especially empirical science, and that we can simply solve every problem there is, and ultimately death. So Pomo really says that's just not true. In fact, we need to be humble about what we understand. However, it also relativizes everything such that meta-narratives such as Christianity, which we know to be the only true meta-narrative religiously, that's impossible. That we all have our narratives, that there are smaller narratives, but there are no meta-narratives. And so irrationalism there tends to dominate. So I take Van Til's approach in criticizing both modernism and postmodernism in that they both function as the thinking of would-be autonomous man. And I always love the way he called it would-be, because it's impossible to be autonomous because we live in God's world and are made in his image. But it is not impossible to be rebels in our thinking. And I think we see that in both of those movements.
Before I follow up with a question on postmodernism, it just occurred to me, did you get to study under Van Til at Westminster in Philadelphia?
I didn't. I had a beer with him a couple times, but I never. He was not teaching when I was there, and I went in '76, so he had retired several years before that. But I did get together with him. I had several friends that knew him personally, and he was very gracious to meet with us. So, okay. And it's through his writings that my own intellectual development was influenced.
Okay. So I appreciate what you said about postmodernism taking us back to history, because one of the features of modernism, like you said, is that it was almost as though where we are right now, we arrived here without a context. And
yes,
I appreciate that about postmodernism as well, that it forces us to grapple with how we arrived where we are, and that everything does have a context. And I remember Mike Horton saying, I believe this was in the Modern Mind class at Westminster Seminary in California, that one of the things he appreciated about postmodernism was its, and this is related to, I think, the last point you were making about it, no one has a God's eye view. And that can, and in the major postmodern writers, does lead to a radical relativism, because there is no meta-narrative if no one has a God's eye view. But Dr. Horton wanted to add to the end of that, so no one has a God's eye view except God. And he would talk about how in the history of philosophy there was Lessing and what we refer to now as Lessing's ugly ditch, where there was no way to bridge from our side of the ditch to anything ultimate on the other side, like God. It reminds us also of Immanuel Kant and his divide between the noumenal and the phenomenal, and that we simply don't have access to ultimate things like God himself. And Horton would say that, God has bridged Lessing's and Kant's gaps there with Jesus, that God has become one of us and bridged that gap so that we can know him. So at least that idea of no one having a God's eye view does introduce some humility into the way that we interact with those around us, but we can have confidence in our knowledge of God because of his word, ultimately being about Jesus. But anyway, I don't know if you want to interact with any of that before we move on.
No, that's in fact, it's funny, Chris, when you were quoting Mike Horton, I immediately thought of Kant, because the nominal phenomenal distinction, noumenal phenomenal, has had a tremendous impact on the 20th century and beyond. Of course, also Kant's century, but people underestimate the importance of philosophy because it gets into academic institutions, and then those academic institutions crank out people in various walks of life, and eventually it comes down into the culture. And I think that while he was purportedly trying to save religion, he, by distinguishing between phenomenal and noumenal, I think it did a great deal of damage. But you're right that it should humble us, even in the way that we understand the Word of God. So he has given us his God's eye view for our lives in this fallen world. But we need to be humble in our interpretation of the Word and understanding that we all have limits and blind spots in understanding what God has revealed.
Amen. Absolutely. So you mentioned earlier that you are recently retired as of June, I believe?
Yes, June 17th was my last Sunday in the pulpit of Amoskeag Presbyterian Church. Okay.
Are you working on anything these days, or are you fully committed to retirement?
Well, yeah, I'm fully committed to retirement in order that I might be able to do a whole bunch of other things that I've never, especially in the last decade since becoming editor of Ordained Servant, had the time to do. However, this summer has been relaxed. I'm trying to catch my breath after a very intense decade and a half, and really 2 decades here at this congregation. And the first part of that, of course, I wrote the book, The Word is Worth 1,000 Pictures, and then more recently have spent much of my time, if not reading a book to review for Ordained Servant, reading the articles and reviews of others. So that I love to continue that, and so I will do that as long as my work is useful to our denomination and officers from other communions. But what I've been doing is a little bit of what's kind of a hobby, 2 hobbies actually. Photography. I just got back from doing a photo shoot, something I've never had the luxury of doing, just spending 3 days in the White Mountains taking pictures and having great fellowship with a dear friend who is a chaplain up in Maine. And so poetry is the other thing that I've been working on since I was 16 and came to enjoy E.E. Cummings. People always think that's remarkable. How could you enjoy E.E. Cummings? Well, if you read E.E. Cummings with a little knowledge of poetry, you, I think, can find him quite interesting. He was a brilliant man who knew the poetry of the past, going back to Middle English. So that's something that I'm going to work on. I have written a lot of poetry, but it takes, according to Donald Hall, who recently died, sometimes as many as 85. He said, I've revised my poem sometimes 85 times. And I'm there, oh boy, I have about 75 more revisions to do on each poem that I've written. So those are 2 things that I'm going to do, and hopefully we'll do some publishing in those areas, maybe even combining poetry and photography. I have a great interest in getting ministers of the Word to appreciate and love poetry. George Herbert has become my all-time favorite, along with the Bard and his sonnets. But the Bible, I think a third of the Bible is made up of poetry. And there's something about the modern world and its scientific precision that just doesn't appreciate poetry for the tremendous value that it has in affecting people's way of seeing things that they haven't seen before, and affecting, especially when it comes to the Psalms, the glory of God as he deals with us in a sinful world.
Amen. That's wonderful. I didn't realize that. So please do let us know when your work gets published. I'm particularly interested in that.
I'm going to be working with a great Hebrew scholar on a popular but thoughtful commentary on Ecclesiastes. And then also The Voice of the Good Shepherd, which is a sequel to The Word is Worth 1,000 Pictures, is something that I actually have a completed manuscript, but it needs some more work. And it really is an amplification of the last two chapters of The Word is Worth 1,000 Pictures. So it does function as a kind of a sequel. I also have an anthology on death and dying that I'm going to be working on. It's an anthology of things that others have written. A booklet on sanctification, which would be like a 30 to 40 page booklet. And that's really a denominational project that I've been asked to do. And then finally, your father's L'Abri, Reflections on the Ministry of Francis Schaeffer. I studied at L'Abri and actually lived in Schaeffer's chalet for about 6 months. And I wrote quite a bit back, maybe 6 or 8 years ago, in Ordained Servant, and I'm putting that together. At this point, I really just need to find a publisher for that. So that should be enough to keep me busy for a while.
Yes, it sounds like it. That's wonderful. I just briefly wanted to observe that poetry seems to run in the veins of biblical theologians. I don't know if you've noticed the same thing.
Yes. I'm glad you mentioned that, Chris, because one of the things that I have loved about Meredith G. Kline's writing is the artistic dimension. His use of words is beautiful. He played the violin. And so, there's that artistic dimension to writing, even if one is not an artist per se, that I think is very important. And you couldn't be an exegete of the Old Testament without appreciating rather deeply poetry.
Absolutely. And Voss even wrote some poetry as well.
He did. I have all of those on my computer. Someone once said that he didn't think they were very good poetry, but the few that I can remember reading now, I thought were really were excellent. So, interesting distinction too that I learned by doing the history of communication studies is that media ecology came out of the liberal arts. And if you look at some of the great media ecologists, they were all involved in the liberal arts. They got their PhDs in some aspect of the liberal arts. Whereas up to that point, when this became something that was being taught now in college and in universities, all discussions about communication and especially electronic communication, were taking place in schools of journalism and communication. So it was more, how to do TV or how to do radio. But in terms of reflecting on it, on communication in the broader context of the liberal arts, there was not much going on before McLuhan. Jacques Ellul would be another who brought these things to our attention in the 20th century.
Very good. So how can our listeners follow you online?
You can email me or call me on the telephone. No, I'm just being a little silly. For years, I own a web address, pilgrimcrossings.org, but it is not up and running. I had it up and running maybe, 8 or 9 years ago. But I kept that from when we had a radio program here at the church. And so I own that name, and I'm hoping I have friends now that I think will help me to develop a website. But that's not presently. The other thing is you could invite me to do a conference of 3 lectures and a sermon called Christian Living in the Electronic Age. I've done that in a number of places. The first was in Cambridge at the RP congregation there, Cambridge, Massachusetts. back in 2003. And then also I have a similar series of lectures for seminary students, and also a 12-hour course that I taught out at Escondido a few years ago. I think it was January of 2015, called An Ecology of Preaching in the Electronic Age. But I love to hear from people, and now I'm going to have a little bit more time to respond or have conversations. And we just recently hosted a couple from Australia, and he was working on organizing the electrical grid of Australia. And as a Christian, he somehow stumbled across my book, and maybe it was through Ordained Servant, actually, and then he stumbled across the book and said that it helped him think through the reorganization of the electrical grid of Australia. So I wondered, how did that happen? I didn't say anything about electrical grids, but he was saying that the way of thinking about environments, which is classic McLuhan, and thinking about our devices as extensions of man, was helpful to him in terms of redesigning for the future that electrical grid. So anyway, it's still somewhat of a mystery to me. But
okay, so you'd prefer listeners to contact you either via email or by phone?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we'll list those methods of contact on the show notes page. And we've been discussing The Word is Worth 1,000 Pictures, Preaching in the Electronic Age by our guest, Pastor Gregory Reynolds. I will put a link to purchase the book on the show notes page, and to incentivize you to buy it, if you order the book within the next 5 days, I will have an amazing offer for you on the next episode, but you have to purchase Pastor Reynolds' book through the link on the show notes page. That's the catch. If you use the link on the show notes page, I'll know, and I'll have a great deal for you on the next episode that you won't want to miss. So thank you, Pastor Reynolds, for joining us this week. It was great talking with you.
Oh, you're very welcome, Chris. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Okay, everyone, please do let us know what you think. You can email us at glorycloudpodcast@gmail.com. You can also tweet at us at glorycloudpod. I am at Machen Guy. And you can also join the Meredith Kline Facebook group by just going to that site and letting the admins know that you listen to the podcast. They can get you added, and we can continue the discussion there. We'll see you next week.